Hey there, Daily Gardeners. Jennifer here. I just wanted to let you know that this week has been a soft open for the Daily Gardener podcast relaunch. So you will notice that yesterday and today there were published episodes, just trying out a few things here. And then the full relaunch will start on Monday of next week. But I need to spend the rest of this week traveling and working on a few of the back end things that make the show work, just to get the website ready, etc., etc. And then we should be good to go. And I look forward to posting new episodes. So anyway, enjoy these 2 episodes. Let me know what you think. And I look forward to a new season of the show, which will start fully on Monday. Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is April 25th. Well, this past Sunday, my husband brought home a little handout that they'd given out at church in honor of Earth Day. It had a lot of little nice ideas, ways that you can connect with nature, whether it's Earth Day or not. It's just a good practice. And so we're all gardeners here, so I thought you'd get a kick out of this. And it just might trigger some new ideas for you as we all get back into the swing of things here in our gardens. Well, the first one is to go for a walk in a quiet place. And because our church has a labyrinth, they suggest using the labyrinth. But it got me thinking about labyrinth gardens. They're very easy to install. I shouldn't say easy. Nothing's ever completely easy in the garden, but they're relatively easy to put in place. And they are such a wonderfully relaxing space, especially if you have a larger property and you're wondering how you can best utilize it. Maybe if you're thinking about incorporating some garden rooms, could definitely be a labyrinth or a spirit walk. You know, another suggestion here was to go to a nature center, a local nature center. Those are always wonderful places to go. You never know when you go to a place like that, what kind of suggestions they're going to have about flora and fauna. Oftentimes, they have many wonderful handouts regarding native plants and plantings. Even if they don't have good information available for free, although many of them do, you will be able to go there and see so many different specimens that you maybe wouldn't see in an urban landscape. So, if you're looking for ideas for plants for your backyard or for your garden or for your front yard, and you want to see something a little different, head to a nature center. You'll probably see at least a handful of things that you might want to investigate for your own property. All right, and then another suggestion here was to go for a walk and find a beautiful tree. Now, I love this suggestion because I think in general, most gardeners need to amp up their tree knowledge and kind of their tree database. We can get so excited about flowers and vegetables that it's easy to forget about trees. But trees are so important. And if I was a new gardener starting out, or if I had just bought a property, trees are always the first place that I start. In fact, today at 3 o'clock, I'm heading over to a garden. And when I think about the vision that I want to put in place for this particular parcel, what I'll be doing is starting with the current trees and then thinking about what future trees need to exist. And then that gap in between is where everything else will happen. Now, one other little piece of encouragement that I want to give you is to head on over to YouTube if you get a chance. There are so many wonderful tree identification videos. I just happened to be on YouTube the last couple of days, and I happened upon some really marvelous tree identification videos. These are really important for people who live in cold climates when you don't always have leaves available on the trees. So check those out, boost your tree identification skills, and also pick up a few books on trees. Some tree books are always good references. Next on the list here is to visit a nearby pond or lake. Now, for gardeners, These types of visits are really important because oftentimes we want to incorporate water elements in our own gardens. Maybe you have a fountain. Maybe you actually are lucky enough to have a river, or maybe you live by a pond. Well, the last thing you want to do is landscape near those water features without familiarizing yourself with what's going on around ponds and lakes in your area. What do you see growing near these naturally wet areas that actually speaks to you? Is it the willow trees? Is it grasses? What do you notice in terms of structure? What do you see for boulders or for trees? Or maybe even man-made items that you like. Maybe there's a fire pit by a pond. Maybe there's a bench or a seating area, or an outcropping of stones that make a council or meeting area. Just a few things to pay attention to on your visit to a pond or a lake nearby. And then we just have 2 left to go here. The next one is to go outside after dark on a clear night and admire the beauty of the stars. And I would also encourage you to look around your garden and your property to see what it looks like at night. What stands out? Where do you need to incorporate elements of lighting? Can you see your walkways and paths? Is it just simply too dangerous to be outside at night? Is there a place where you can go in your garden in the evening to enjoy being outside? Do you have a gazebo, for instance? Is there a fire pit area? Is there a spot where there's some cafe lighting and some mosquito netting? That probably also needs to be a consideration if you're going to go out at night. And then finally, the last suggestion here, and I think it's such a good activity for gardeners, is to be part of a park or highway cleanup event. Maybe this is the year that you and your family or some friends want to adopt a highway or adopt a street or adopt a local park. All of those things are good ways that you can give back, be good stewards of the environment, share your garden wisdom, and make a positive difference in your own community. All right, it's time for today's garden history. All right, today we kick things off with John Mulso, who wrote to his friend, the English naturalist Gilbert White in Selborne on this day, April 25th, in 1766. Now, Gilbert White, the man that John was writing to, his friend, was born in 1720. So he was 46 years old when he was receiving this letter from John. And at the time, Gilbert had been keeping a journal about the goings-on in his garden. Now, this journal went on for about 3 decades in total, and it was eventually published. And today, people love reading through Gilbert White's notations and comments. And when his journals were published, when his recordings were made public, people immediately recognized that Gilbert had a knack for observing the natural world and for describing in a relatable way all of the goings-on. Gilbert was very curious. He was also really personable. And so John starts out, it's the end of April, it's 1766, and he begins by writing about this point of agreement. And of course, that's the garden. And so John says, "Vegetation thrives apace now. I suppose that you are quite intent on your new study." And here John is alluding to the fact that Gilbert is throwing himself into his work. There's something in the garden that has his attention. Then John continues and basically says in Old English that his friend Gilbert does not like to look up and see visitors when he'd rather keep his head down looking at the ground. In fact, John writes, "I presume you will go with your eyes fixed on the ground most part of the summer." So Gilbert has one thing that's getting his attention, and it is all of the things that he's growing in his garden. And then next, John makes a very astute observation. Gilbert was like many pastors or reverends that were also keen naturalists or gardeners. During the growing season, they were often very distracted by their gardens and enjoyed spending more time pursuing that passion than writing sermons. And so John writes, "You will pass with country folks as a man always making sermons, but you are really only considering a weed." So good insight there from John. And he ends by saying, "I knew in general that all flesh was grass, but I did not know that grass was flesh before." So there you go. A long ago letter from one gardener to another. And today, back in 1809, Thomas Jefferson was retired, and he was enjoying spending time, finally, in his garden. He was no longer consumed with the duties of being president. We know that in the last year of his presidency, he spent many, many hours pining for his garden and spending time growing the plants that he'd been accumulating from his friend Bernard McMahon, as well as other plantsmen and seedsmen. And so he'd been dreaming of this moment, retiring and spending time as a gardener. In fact, he wrote to his friend on this day, "I am constantly in my garden or farms and am exclusively employed out of doors as I was within doors when I was at Washington." So he's spending all his time outside. And then he says, "I find myself infinitely happier in my new mode of life." And isn't that an interesting observation and something that may pass by unnoticed? But this change in seasons, the warmer weather, getting outdoors, plays a role in our attitudes and in our moods. We get more vitamin D. We feel more energy. We're eating the fresh green offerings from our gardens, whether it's microgreens or asparagus. The rhubarb is popping. Heck, you can even eat some hosta leaves, those little tiny rolled up cigars as they emerge from the earth. You can cut them and fry them up in a pan the same way that you would asparagus. And if they're good enough for the deer, they're good enough for us. They're pretty tasty. The key is to harvest them early, just like you would the fiddleheads. The joys of spring. And today in 1851, George Herbert Engleheart was born. And like Gilbert White, Engleheart was a pastor. He was a reverend, but he was also a gardener and a passionate plantsman. Back in 1889, he began breeding daffodils, some 700 varieties in his lifetime. Sadly, so many of them have been lost to time, but we know that some survived. So if you like Beersheba or Lucifer or White Lady, you owe a debt of gratitude to Reverend Engleheart. Engleheart spent every spare minute that he could breeding daffodils and working with plants, and it was not uncommon for his parishioners to go to the church only to find a little note tacked on the door, and it would say this: "No service today, working with daffodils." It always reminds me of the little notes that gardeners hang on their porch door or maybe somewhere on their front door, and the sign will read something very similar to what Reverend Englehart's said all those years ago. It'll say something sweet, like "in the garden." And if you don't have one of those signs, you can grab a little chalkboard, add a little twine to hang it, and make your own. And it was on this day, April 25th in 1905, that there was a big wedding in the botanical community. And it was David Fairchild, the great botanist, marrying the daughter of Alexander Graham Bell. Marian and David Fairchild had a long and happy marriage. David Fairchild went on his plant explorations, and Marian would often accompany him. Together, the couple had 3 children. It was a very happy marriage. And of course, David Fairchild is considered American botanical royalty for all of his collecting and introducing plants to the United States. And those plants include items like pistachios, mangoes, dates, soybeans, flowering cherries, and nectarines. If there was no David Fairchild, we would not have cherry trees flowering in Washington, D.C. We might not have kale at Trader Joe's. David Fairchild is the man who brought kale to the United States after one of his trips. He also brought the avocado here as well. David Fairchild had a fair amount of luck in his life. I think if you talk to most successful people, they'll speak about luck or circumstances playing to their favor. In David's case, he had a generous benefactor, a wealthy woman named Barbara Latham, who funded many of his adventures. And of course, by marrying Marianne Bell, his father-in-law was none other than Alexander Graham Bell, and I'm sure that connection opened some doors for David Fairchild as well. Now, today you can continue to learn about David Fairchild and see his legacy at the Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden in Coral Gables, Florida. It is filled with many of the plants that David himself collected, and of course, it's named in his honor. And today in 1911, a gardener named Harry Radland out of Selborne, Wisconsin, shared his notes from his garden with a seedsman named Henry Field. That year, Henry had announced a little garden contest for his customers. He said he wanted to encourage good gardening, and he put their stories all together in a book that he called The Book of 1,000 Gardens. In the foreword, Henry wrote, "I requested them to send in the stories of their gardens, true unvarnished stories, telling what they grew, how they grew it, what paid the best, how big the garden was, what troubles they had, and how they overcame them. And I asked them to send in pictures, if possible. And these letters, like the one that Harry wrote and sent in, were compiled and put together in this book called The Book of 1,000 Gardens. It's really a treasure." Henry wrote, "The only trouble is I ran short of room in the book. It would have taken a book as big as Webster's unabridged to hold all of the letters in full. I had to whittle them down to fit." So here's what Harry Radland wrote back in 1911, over 100 years ago. "On April 23rd, I planted some kale seed from you, Henry Field. We tried to raise kale for 10 years, but never had any success." And so here he's stroking Henry's ego a bit. He writes, "This year, the best is about 3.5 feet high and about 3 feet wide without spreading the leaves." So no wonder this letter got picked to be in the book. Good endorsement for Henry there. Harry continues and he writes, "On the same day, I planted some dill, parsley, onion seed, and onion sets. The dill grew good and went to seed. The parsley didn't grow very good at all. My early cabbage grew good and all the heads were used." And then he writes, "The first planting of radishes was on this day, April 25th, back in 1911. He says, "I have had radishes all summer, and the Shenandoah tomatoes in the garden are dandies, the best we ever had." A little glimpse into the life of gardener Harry Radland in Selborne, Wisconsin. And finally, today we end garden history by remembering an American author and poet, Leslie Young Carruthers. He died on this day of a heart attack in 1948. And much about Leslie has been lost to time, but one of his accomplishments are these little garden books of poetry that are very challenging to find. I actually got my copies on eBay, and I just love them. I think they're so precious, and they're filled with little pieces of poetry about various plants in nature, in the garden. Now, these books are really tiny little pamphlets. They're not big at all, but Leslie produced about, I want to say, a half a dozen or so. They've got adorable little titles like These Shady Friends. Here he's writing about trees. And then there are a couple of books called These Blooming Friends, followed up by a book called More Blooming Friends. And this is all his garden poetry. Now, Leslie's friends called him Reggie. I didn't realize that until recently when I stumbled on some more uncovered research about him. But this was a fantastic clue, and I actually think that one of the little books that I bought on eBay was one of his copies because he signed it Reggie, and then he wrote about in the margins how the different garden plants that he was writing about were from a friend's garden, and he actually lists her name in the book, which now makes it even more precious to me. But I thought what I would do is just share a few little snippets from Leslie just to give you a taste. He's very whimsical when he writes, and he clearly loves the garden and plants. And here's a little poem that he wrote about lemon verbena. He writes, "If I were allowed to only grow one fragrant herb, I know I'd choose lemon verbena. Oh yes, my views are prejudiced. I'll admit it's so. But I love the way she scents my garden at close of day on a silver plate or in a crystal bowl. A spray of her leaves delights my soul." Isn't that cute? And then here's one that he wrote about the foxglove. "The foxglove in the garden is very, very sly. She always looks at the earth below, not at the passerby. But I will tell her secret, known only to birds and trees. When no one is near, with her spotted lips, she eats the bumblebees." Very cute. And then here's one from his book called More Blooming Friends. This one is about the monk's hood. "Beware of the monk's hood. His deep purple cowl is a tricky disguise. He's as wise as an owl. You may think that he bends his hand over to prey. He doesn't. He brews fearful poisons all day. He's a wicked magician, by evil obsessed. Don't be tricked by his acting or how he is dressed." So that's what he wrote about monkshood. Obviously, a very poisonous plant, very beautiful. I used to grow monkshood right outside my front door, but I got so discouraged growing it because it wouldn't bloom until October, long after so many of my other plants in the garden had already gone to sleep. So I didn't feel like it fit with my garden. It was such a late bloomer. But in any case, this gives you a little sampling of the poetry of Leslie Young Carruthers, known as Reggie to his friends. And so I'm just hoping to make gardeners aware of some of his work. It's very quaint and charming. And that's today's garden history. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Gardener's Guide to Prairie Plants by Neil DeBall and Hilary Cox. Well, this book came out this year. It's another brand new book for gardeners, and it is an invaluable reference for prairie plants. So if you are working with native plants, if you are putting together a tiny meadow, like we discussed with yesterday's book, Tiny and Wild, or if you simply want to add to your garden reference collection, then this book is truly a gem. Here's what Doug Tallamy wrote about this book. I think Doug is probably one of the top experts when it comes to prairie plants. Doug writes, if you are looking for the complete, and I do mean complete guide to prairie ecosystems, you will not do much better than this book. The authors not only cover what prairie species look like at each stage of their growth, first, they also dive deep into their historical and ecological roles in prairie ecosystems. So, an exceptional book and reference guide. Now, what I love about this book is the way they produced the cover of this book. This is really meant to be a field guide. The cover, even though it's a paperback, it's kind of got a little more firm cover that's wrapped around it, and it's also washable. So I imagine having this book in the car with me, out in the garden with me. It's just such a wonderful resource. Now, I just want to take a second and say, have you ever seen Neil DeBall? Maybe you have, maybe you are lucky enough to have attended one of his workshops or presentations. But I just want to say he is the friendliest looking guy, and he is so approachable and sincere and genuinely passionate about plants. I've watched some videos of him on YouTube. He is a wonderful, very generous speaker and expert in the area of native plants, prairie plants, meadows, wildflowers, and the like. So the minute I saw that he was one of the authors for this book, I immediately put a little heart by it. And I was like, yes, I need to see this copy so that I can see what he did and I can also tell you about it. Now, I'm going to walk you through how the book is structured, but I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds here, no pun intended, but I will walk you through each of the chapters. So the book starts out with the history and ecology of the prairie. They do talk about understanding your soil, which is obviously really important for growing anything, much less prairie plants. Then they talk about how to design, plant, and maintain prairie gardens. Chapter 5 is a big chapter because it's talking about all the different types of plants. It's a prairie species field guide. They go into great detail about monocots and dicots, grasses and sedges. This is about 300 plus pages worth of data here. Chapter 6 is all about establishing a successful prairie meadow. And so that dovetails nicely with yesterday's book, Tiny and Wild. So this would be a great companion piece to that book. I would say that book is more artistic and design oriented. This book is more of a reference. Chapter 7 talks about burning your prairie safely. Chapter 8 is propagating prairie plants from seed, which is pretty easy to do and also a great way to save money because obviously if you're creating a prairie, you need to have plants in mass. Chapter 9 is propagating plants vegetatively. So 2 great chapters on propagation there. Then chapter 10 is a really nice add to this book. It's the prairie food web. So there's a deep dive on that. And then there is a really nice chapter, chapter 11 at the back of the book, goes through the various prairie seed mixes that you might be intrigued by. So if you are considering growing a prairie, I had a friend do this a couple of years ago over in Corcoran, a community nearby to Maple Grove, and they did a beautiful job. But anyone who's grown a prairie will tell you there is the science of growing a prairie, which is exactly what is covered in this book. And then there is the art of growing a prairie and maintaining a prairie. So it's a little bit of both. It's the yin and yang of prairies. But this book will be an absolutely indispensable guide if you are serious and curious about prairie plants, native plants, especially if you're doing some restoration work. Maybe you are a landscaper and you need to work with a lot of native plants. Maybe you're just a gardener who has a passion for prairies, meadows, wildflowers, and that type of thing. But this is a really, really great guide. It's a heavy book, but it's not so heavy that it's cumbersome or not usable. Now, this book, because Neil and Hillary are such great experts, this book is getting a ton of praise. They both have lots of street cred, and rightfully so. This book is 636 pages, although it doesn't feel like it, of prairie plants. everything you need to know. A truly definitive guide, a one-stop compendium is what they say about this book on Amazon. You can get a copy of The Gardener's Guide to Prairie Plants, first edition by Neil DeBall and Hilary Cox, and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $25. And it is a worthy investment. All right, we end the show today with a little botanic spark that features Maurice Baring. He was a soldier during World War I. He was with the Royal Flying Corps, and he kept a war diary. And I think that Maurice would be surprised and yet delighted to know that he is part of a gardening podcast here in 2023. But I found an adorable little review of his diary, which became a book called A War Diary by Maurice Baring. And so I want to read what he wrote on this day, but I also want to share this little review of his book. So let me do that, and then I will get into what he wrote during this time, April of 1917, and maybe a little bit of May. We'll see how far we get here. But the reviewer wrote, "The remarkable thing about Maurice's book is that although it has an objective quality, it is also extraordinarily personable." Maurice noted down whatever interested him at the moment during the war, and he conveys to us what the war was in reality to him. There's news and odd rumors that pour in from all sides. Men are fighting and being killed, and Maurice often stops to record the death of a friend. Yet his other interests persist, and for me as a gardener, I absolutely delighted in the number of times that he mentions some plant or something that's happening in nature. And it was clearly an anchor for him in the midst of the chaos and the heartbreak of wartime. Now, this reviewer notes that Maurice is not always thinking about the war. He copies passages from the books that he reads. He quotes poets. He translates Horace. He speculates about this and that. And he trusts that if he puts down all of these things without emphasis, that we will get a picture of what World War I was actually like. The reviewer encourages us to dip in anywhere, and you will find observations that are noted down simply and quickly by a man who was quite sensitive to the many sides of life. So here's what Maurice wrote on this day, April 25th in 1917. So this is an entry about the war, but then on the following days, Maurice is giving us a glimpse into his personality and showing us some of the things that he appreciated about nature and about literature. So on April 25th in 1917, Maurice gives an account of flying over the Fourth Army. He writes, "We heard 2 shots in the air on the way there. On the way back, a kite balloon was shot down and floated down into the river. We were looking at this, and at that moment, a scout appeared in the sky. I thought it was a German. I was terrified. It turned out to be an SE, whatever that means, but it was not a German." And then he concludes, "It was bitterly cold," and he writes, "The earth looked like it was a photograph, a war photograph." Then on April 26th, he gets a little lighter. He writes, "I cannot read any more, not another line of The Golden Bowl by Henry James." He'd had enough. Then on April 28th, he writes about the garden at the headquarters where he was working. "The garden is full of oxlips and cowslips. The trees are red with sap. The hedges are budding." On April 29th, he talks about Harvey Kelly, the man who commanded the number 19 Squadron. He notes that he always took a potato and a reel of cotton with him when he went over the lines. And then 3 days later, He writes that a fellow flyer by the name of Ball is missing. His departure and likely death had cast a gloom over the entire group of men. Maurice noted he was the most modest and engaging character. So a little look back at World War I through the eyes of a man who was a nature lover, a gardener, and a pilot. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Gardener. Don't forget to channel your inner Gilbert White. Keep your head down and enjoy the garden. You can channel your inner Reverend Engleheart and put together a little sign for your front door that says you're busy in the garden if people need to get a hold of you. And you can also channel your inner Leslie Carruthers, your inner Reggie, and maybe sit down and write a little verse for your favorite flower. It's a fun activity to do on a nice spring day. And a reminder for you that you always have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.